The last photograph taken inside the Schlosskloster, prior to its closure in 1967, shows rows of empty pews, dusted with a light fall of plaster from the crumbling vaulted ceiling. What the image does not reveal is the fate of the 241 individuals who entered the monastery between 1933 and 1967 and were never seen again. Though officially dissolved by the state of Bavaria for structural concerns, recent discoveries buried in diocesan archives suggest something far more deliberate. This is not a story of ghostly apparitions or folklore. This is the story of institutional disappearance. To the public, the Schlosskloster Heiligenberg was a secluded but revered site of contemplative monastic life. Perched above the Danube on a wooded cliffside in Lower Bavaria, the monastery had long been known for producing hand-bound Bibles, hosting theological retreats, and offering respite for the morally troubled. Its cloistered silence was marketed as sacred. Few questioned why no one ever returned. Fewer still were allowed inside. Now more than 5 decades after its quiet abandonment, sealed documents and hidden testimonies reveal the staggering human cost behind its stone walls. In the early spring of 1933, as Germany convulsed under the rise of National Socialism, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Regensburg quietly reopened the Schlosskloster Heiligenberg after nearly a century of disuse. The property, originally built in the 1670s as a Benedictine monastery and later seized by the state during secularization, had sat dormant, its sandstone walls mottled with ivy, its bell tower silenced by rust. But with political tensions rising and the church seeking to preserve influence under a regime increasingly hostile to traditional authority, the diocese saw an opportunity. On paper, the monastery's new mission was described as pastoral rehabilitation, a center where troubled clergy, wayward seminarians, and morally compromised laity could retreat for spiritual correction. In practice, however, it operated as a cloistered facility from which few emerged. Staffed almost entirely by clergy, transferred from other controversial institutions across Germany, the Schlosskloster's leadership was largely exempt from diocesan scrutiny. It was geographically isolated and administratively self-contained, with its own postal routing and supply chain. The state registered it not as a monastery but as a private religious estate, exempting it from routine inspection. Father Jakob Lissner, appointed rector in 1934, embodied the new direction. A former theology professor with alleged ties to Catholic nationalist groups, Lissner ran the facility with the strictness of a military camp. Residents, referred to as penitents, were stripped of outside contact upon arrival. Incoming mail was intercepted. No telephone lines were permitted. No photography was allowed beyond the gate. In the monastery's records, most individuals were listed only by their baptismal names and assigned numbers. The majority were sent by diocesan tribunals as part of internal disciplinary decisions, often without trial or documentation. To those outside the church, Schlosskloster Heiligenberg remained shrouded in obscurity. The few photos printed in Catholic newsletters portrayed serene prayer walks and manuscript work in candlelit rooms. The diocese described it as a haven of grace where troubled souls seek light. When German authorities requested a census of religious institutions in 1938, the monastery submitted only a single-page document listing its total population as fluctuating, 28 to 35 individuals in spiritual retreat. No names were included, yet rumors began to surface. Villagers from Niederwinkel, the nearest town 5 kilometers downhill, reported hearing distant chanting at unnatural hours. Hunters spoke of shuttered windows where candlelight flickered through the night. A railway worker named Ernst Barlach, who maintained the supply line from Regensburg to Heiligenberg until his sudden dismissal in 1941, later told his granddaughter that he once saw 10 men unloading crates marked "donation" that groaned. When moved, the monastery's defenses against scrutiny were subtle but effective. Clergy who asked questions were told the facility was essential to spiritual hygiene. Families who inquired about loved ones were met with polite deferrals. The diocese began encouraging discretion among parish priests, framing the monastery as a place for the morally contagious, warning that even mentioning its purpose might constitute scandal. When the war intensified and Nazi intelligence increasingly monitored church activities, Schloss-Kloster Heiligenberg became even more opaque. A 1943 memo from the Ministry of Ecclesiastical Affairs in Munich refers to it obliquely as a secured pastoral house of internal discipline. Internal church documents from that same year, recently unsealed, show a directive to begin cremating deceased residents on site. No cemetery was ever constructed. The monastery's registry for deaths between 1943 and 1949 records only 7 names. After the war, the monastery was neither denazified nor examined by the Allied occupation forces. Its religious designation shielded it. It resumed normal operations by 1946, quietly receiving penitents from across Central Europe. With the post-war rise of religious conservatism, many diocesan leaders saw such institutions as vital to moral restoration. Their internal workings remained off-limits. The few who returned from the monastery did so in silence. Among them was Franz Obermeier, a seminarian from Passau, who vanished from his parish in 1952 and reappeared 4 years later as a groundskeeper at a church near the Austrian border. In a 1979 interview, obtained by the Austrian Catholic Reconciliation Commission, but never made public, he described the monastery as a place where your voice was confiscated. We were not healed there. We were erased. As the 1950s progressed, the monastery's isolation increased. Its entrance road was narrowed deliberately. Phone access in Niederwinkel was cut by the diocese in 1956 during a dispute with local authorities. Monks from other orders who attempted to visit were turned away. The only people routinely allowed inside were a small group of diocesan-approved tradesmen and deliverymen, most of whom were required to sign non-disclosure agreements. By 1961, nearly every record concerning Schloss-Kloster Heiligenberg's operations had been rerouted to a private ecclesiastical archive in Würzburg. A request from the Regensburg Seminary in 1963 to send a student for a week-long retreat was denied, due to the penitential specificity of the site. Yet within church circles, the monastery maintained an odd prestige. Bishops referred to it as the deep well. Archbishop Ludwig Meissner of Bamberg once wrote, "Those sent to Heiligenberg return either sanctified or not at all." To outsiders, especially journalists attempting to investigate, the monastery was a closed circuit. The Bavarian press law of 1964 contained a clause, reportedly inserted at the request of religious leaders, that exempted certain ecclesiastical institutions from public disclosure obligations. When a Frankfurter journalist named Inge Kröger tried to investigate the disappearance of a young deacon in 1965, her newspaper received a legal warning citing interference with internal religious correctional processes. Then came the final winter. In February 1967, a snowstorm blanketed Niederwinkel. Telephone service across Lower Bavaria was disrupted for 2 days. When the roads cleared, a maintenance crew sent by the electric company reported finding the monastery unlit. The main gates, usually padlocked, were ajar. Inside, they found the chapel cold, the refectory abandoned, and every cell empty. The building showed no signs of struggle, only hurried departure. Several rooms had been stripped. The crematorium furnace was cold. The diocesan emblem had been removed from the entryway. No official statement was issued. 3 weeks later, the diocese quietly reclassified the monastery property as uninhabited sanctuary grounds. The government registered it as ecclesiastical ruins. And in April 1967, a private demolition crew contracted by an unnamed religious trust sealed off the access road and buried the main foundation under concrete. In the spring of 1982, 15 years after the Schloss-Kloster's closure, a battered box surfaced in the archive basement of the Regensburg diocesan office. Mislabeled and coated in mildew, it contained fragments of a handwritten census ledger. The document had no official heading, but the dates spanned from 1934 to 1967. Each line listed an arrival date, a first name only, a number, and a final column marked either relocated, absolved, or simply left blank. Of the 477 names recorded, 241 bore no exit notation. The discovery was made by Renate Höfer, a young administrative assistant recently hired to assist with archive reorganization. She brought the ledger to her supervisor, Father Anton Wurl, who allegedly ordered her not to mention it. Weeks later, Hofer was reassigned to a parish school in Upper Franconia, but before leaving Regensburg she made copies. Decades later, in a sworn affidavit given to the Bavarian Clerical Review Board, she described Father Wurl's reaction as immediate suppression, like someone throwing a tarp over a body. The copied pages circulated quietly among a handful of dissident church historians and former clergy. Most were hesitant to draw conclusions, citing the ambiguous nature of the final column. Yet one retired canon lawyer, Ludwig Harnack, noted in a private memo that the number of unexplained absences strongly exceeds any known diocesan retention or transfer rate. He added that no death records existed for those names, nor any reassignment logs, suggesting a total disappearance from ecclesiastical documentation. Outside the church, however, interest remained limited. Bavarian media in the early 1980s focused heavily on economic recovery and post-war reconciliation, and those with institutional memory of the monastery were aging. The villagers of Niederwinkel, many of whom had once delivered food, tended fences or worked in silence for the monastery, began to die off. One exception was Ernst Reithofer, a former carpenter, who in 1984 spoke with a researcher from the University of Passau. Reithofer recalled repairing window frames at the Schlosskloster in 1959 and seeing a row of men in identical robes, heads shaven, not monks but kept like them. The university researcher Klaus Niederberger began compiling oral testimonies from locals and former diocesan workers. His notes, later published in a limited academic journal, included repeated references to a locked stone annex beneath the eastern wing of the monastery. Referred to by multiple sources as the narrow house, it was described as inaccessible, soundproofed, and guarded by monks not listed in regular staffing records. One anonymous testimony claimed the annex had no interior door, only a hatch accessible from above. Niederberger's investigation stalled after a fire destroyed his archive room in 1986. Officially ruled accidental, the incident came 2 weeks after he submitted a formal request to the diocese for building blueprints of the Schlosskloster. He was never granted access. Niederberger eventually abandoned the project, taking a teaching post in Freiburg. Before leaving, he mailed a letter to his colleague at Tübingen stating simply, "They kept them underground, we were all complicit." By the early 1990s, a handful of independent journalists began connecting the monastery to unresolved disappearances in the region. Among them was Daniela Bruckner, whose younger uncle, a theology student named Tobias Kranz, vanished in 1960 after being summoned to Regensburg for reorientation. Family letters revealed he had objected to church doctrine on corporal penance. He was last seen boarding a diocesan transport vehicle. Bruckner's freedom of information requests were repeatedly denied, and a diocesan official informed her in writing that Mr. Kranz's trajectory concluded within ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Bruckner's persistence, however, led her to contact Armin Kessler, a retired postman from Niederwinkel who had personally delivered parcels to the Schlosskloster from 1955 to 1966. Kessler provided her with a map of the access road, now buried, and a detailed description of the inner grounds. According to his account, deliveries were never signed. Instead, a metal chute would lower from the wall, into which he would slide packages. Once, after a delay, he said a voice had muttered through the chute, "Don't speak, they hear everything." Armed with this testimony, Bruckner and a freelance photographer, Jürgen Peel, attempted to locate the foundation of the former monastery in June 1993. Overgrown and partially reclaimed by forest, the site yielded little at first. But after several hours, they found remnants of a stone arch beneath a collapsed hillock. A narrow gap revealed an iron ladder descending into darkness. What they discovered was documented in 4 rolls of film, later seized by Bavarian police during a house raid on Peel's apartment. Bruckner described the descent in her unpublished notes, later recovered and leaked anonymously. Cold air like a sealed cellar, brick walls slick with mold, a corridor that bent left, then down. We saw 5 doors, none opened. Each had bolts on the outside. The 5th had scratch marks, deep ones. like a desperate animal. They left without forcing entry, fearing structural collapse. 2 days later, Peel was detained on charges of trespassing and possession of restricted ecclesiastical property. The rolls of film were never returned. The police report on the raid, partially declassified in 2009, refers to the Schlosskloster site as protected ground under diocesan custodianship. No legal precedent for such protection could be found in Bavarian land records. When a regional deputy, Klaus Heberling, questioned the Interior Ministry about the designation, he received a terse reply. Matters of sacred heritage fall outside the purview of public inquiry. Facing institutional silence, Bruckner turned to survivors. Her letters, sent to dozens of parishes across Bavaria and Austria, eventually reached Otto Felder, a former novice who had entered Schlosskloster Heiligenberg in 1948 at the age of 17. Now living in a hospice in Salzburg, Felder agreed to a taped interview. His voice, frail and cracked, carried the weight of memory. They called us by number. I was 43. We were made to kneel for hours. Those who resisted were taken to the annex. We never saw them again. Only the bell rang, always once, never twice. Felder's testimony, corroborated by a second former resident who refused to be named, marked the first direct acknowledgement of coercive confinement within the monastery. Neither man could confirm the fate of those taken to the annex, but both remembered the daily silence that followed. No prayers for them, Felder said, no candles, just the bell. By 1995, Bruckner had compiled a dossier of 87 unresolved disappearances potentially linked to the Schlosskloster. Most involved seminarians, lay penitents, or theological students sent for doctrinal realignment. Each case had vanished from public record within weeks of referral. Several included families who received unsigned letters claiming successful reintegration, yet no further contact ever occurred. In an attempt to bring public attention to the case, Bruckner presented her findings to the Bundestag Committee on Religious Transparency. Her petition was dismissed. The official response noted that ecclesiastical matters fall under the autonomy of the religious institutions involved. One committee member, privately sympathetic, told her to follow the crematorium records if they still exist. This prompted Bruckner to pursue environmental testing at the site, now officially designated as Undeveloped Religious Reserve. Using thermal imaging, her team identified an area of consistent subterranean heat fluctuation beneath what had once been the eastern wing. Despite multiple requests, excavation permits were denied on grounds of religious protection and historical sanctity. The final effort to expose the truth came in 1998, when a local pastor, Gerhard Blum, publicly accused the diocese of deliberate institutionalized erasure. Blum, whose father had been transferred to the Schlosskloster in 1957 and never returned, spoke during a televised panel. His words were precise, almost defiant. This was not a retreat. It was a mechanism, a funnel, and it devoured the inconvenient. Blum was suspended from clerical duties within weeks. When contacted in 2001 for follow-up, he declined to speak, stating only, "The silence has weight. It crushes you if you push too hard." As of 2025, the site remains off-limits, overgrown and unmarked. No memorial stands for the vanished. The concrete slab above the foundation remains intact, yet under its weight, those who search still hear the bell, one toll only, never two. In September of 1954, Bishop Norbert Weissen, an Austrian ecclesiastical envoy assigned to review regional seminarian conduct in southern Bavaria, arrived unannounced at the Schlosskloster Heiligenberg. His visit, described in a later memorandum as observational and fraternal in nature, was triggered by 3 separate petitions from Austrian families whose sons had been transferred to the monastery and subsequently vanished from all diocesan correspondence. Bishop Weissen's itinerary placed him in Niederwinkel for only 2 days, yet by the time he returned to Vienna, his demeanor had shifted. Our fellow bishop described him in private correspondence as unsettled, prone to long silences, evasive about his journey. The report Bishop Weissen submitted upon his return was classified under the Austrian Episcopal Council's restricted correspondence and remained sealed until 2008. Once released, it revealed a disturbing first-hand account. Access to the grounds was permitted only after prolonged delay. Inside, I was shown only the cloister garden, the chapel, and the scriptorium. Residents did not speak, nor were they permitted to do so. One man, appearing no older than 20, bore extensive bruising across his jawline and temple. When I inquired about medical care, the rector stated, "We mend in spirit, not in flesh." Adwyson's report continued with a description of heavy doors, reinforced beyond necessity, and a persistent odor he identified as chemical ash. When asked about the monastery's crematory practices, Rector Listener replied, "We handle our ends internally." The bishop's concluding remarks warned that the site operates outside moral regulation. Its claim to penance masks a regimen closer to erasure than reconciliation. No action was taken. The Austrian Episcopal Council declined to intervene, citing jurisdictional boundaries. Internally, however, the report circulated among a small circle of ecclesiastical ethicists. One such figure, Father Ulrich Ramser of Graz, wrote in a private letter that, "If even a tenth of Wyson's claims are true, we are looking not at spiritual retreat, but institutionalized quarantine of dissidents." He recommended discreet investigation. None occurred. During this same period, a pattern of ignored warnings emerged within the Bavarian diocese itself. Between 1952 and 1964, at least 17 formal letters were submitted by parish priests expressing concern about the disappearance of individuals sent to the Schlosskloster. Most cited unexplained gaps in correspondence, lack of death notices, and the diocese's refusal to provide reassignment details. One such letter, dated March 19, 1958, came from Father Matthias Krell of Landshut. In it, he describes the case of Rudolf Pischler, a young man sent to the monastery after confessing to theological deviation and self-abuse. Pischler's parents received a single letter after his arrival, composed in detached language and signed only with a stamped emblem. After that, no contact. When Krell attempted to inquire, he was summoned to Regensburg and warned that further inquiry would result in disciplinary reassessment of your own posting. He remained silent thereafter. Other letters were more explicit. In 1960, Father Anselm Bruck of Amberg wrote, "I believe the Schlosskloster may be functioning as a site of indefinite containment beyond ecclesiastical due process. We are losing them into silence." His letter was marked unanswered in the diocesan reply log. Bruck retired early the following year, citing personal crisis of faith. He left no public statement. The most revealing correspondence came not from clergy, but from a religious courier named Helmut Seiler, whose responsibility included the physical transport of internal diocesan communications and materials across Lower Bavaria. In 1963, Seiler was assigned a delivery to the Schlosskloster consisting of sealed packets and boxed communion supplies. According to his wife, he returned visibly shaken, refused to eat for 2 days, and began drafting a report intended for Bishop Meinhardt of Regensburg. Only the first page of that report remains. It reads, "Upon completing the delivery, I was delayed by weather and instructed to wait overnight in the courtyard. During this time I observed 3 individuals escorted into the cellar wing in chains. Their heads were shaved, their eyes were covered. No monastic vows justify this treatment. This is not discipline, this is detention." The remaining pages vanished. 3 days after submitting the draft, Helmut Seiler was reported missing. His car was found abandoned near a forestry trail 15 kilometers from the monastery. Inside, investigators discovered a satchel with his delivery logs and personal prayer book, but no sign of struggle. Local police issued a short-lived inquiry, which was closed within a month. Official cause of disappearance: presumed voluntary departure. No record exists of Seiler's body ever being recovered. His wife, Erika Seiler, attempted to press for renewed investigation in 1968, but was discouraged by the diocesan legal office, who informed her that such matters rest in divine adjudication. She lived the remainder of her life in Passau, never remarrying, and reportedly kept her husband's draft letter in a locked drawer until her death in 1989. By the mid-1960s, These ignored signs had accumulated into an undercurrent of unease among lower clergy. Several minor seminaries began quietly advising students against requesting retreat time at the Schlosskloster, though no official policy ever acknowledged this shift. Instead, rumors spread that the monastery solved problems no one else could, that once inside your soul is no longer your own, that the bell only rings for departures, never arrivals. In 1966, a young deacon named Emil Höttinger attempted to challenge the monastery's operations publicly. Ordained less than a year, he had been assigned to assist the diocese's correctional registry office and was tasked with preparing files for the annual penitential review. In doing so, he discovered a discrepancy. Dozens of individuals listed as currently in rehabilitation at Schlosskloster Heiligenberg had no updated file entries for over 5 years. Höttinger compiled his findings into a report addressed to the Regional Council of Clergy, attaching a request for internal audit. 2 weeks later, he was removed from his position and reassigned to a remote village in the Berchtesgaden Mountains. No audit was conducted. When interviewed years later, Höttinger reflected, "I wasn't punished, I was buried. They didn't burn me, but they put me where no one would see the smoke." The final warning ignored came not from inside the church, but from a secular angle. In January 1967, a municipal engineer named Horst Wiebmann filed a concern with the Regional Planning Office regarding the structural and drainage inconsistencies of the Schlosskloster grounds. He had been tasked with reviewing terrain maps for potential development in surrounding Niederwinkel and noticed that the monastery's drainage system terminated in a sealed basin not connected to any known public sanitation grid. His report, preserved in city archives, notes, "Site appears to have been designed to retain runoff within an enclosed loop. Unclear whether this is for environmental, ritual, or containment purposes. Request further geological survey." No survey was conducted. 2 weeks later, during the great snowfall of February 1967, the monastery fell silent. Within a month, it was abandoned. The drainage records were lost. In the autumn of 1972, 5 years after the Schlosskloster's abrupt abandonment, a team of unauthorized excavators arrived quietly at the former monastery site. Funded privately by 2 families whose sons had vanished into the institution during the 1950s, the effort was coordinated under the guise of geological sampling. Records show that the land had been officially reclassified as archival religious terrain by the Diocese of Regensburg, rendering any state-led excavation legally impossible without ecclesiastical approval. The families, having exhausted all channels of appeal, hired a civil engineer and a former surveyor to investigate the eastern quadrant of the buried complex. The team worked at night, clearing brush and lifting sections of concrete poured hastily over the original structure. By the 3rd night, they had exposed part of what appeared to be a ventilation shaft, narrow and rusted shut. When forced open, it released a wave of ammonia-stained air and the dry stench of aged ash. Beneath the grate, a vertical shaft descended into darkness. One member of the crew lowered a flashlight on a cable and reported seeing a stone corridor branching into multiple archways. Before further entry could be attempted, the site was interrupted. A vehicle arrived at dawn bearing diocesan emblems. 3 men emerged, none in clerical dress, and ordered the workers to leave. Though no formal police report was filed, the land was immediately re-secured. Within a week, fresh concrete had been poured over the exposed area. The 2 families who had financed the search received cease and desist letters citing trespass upon consecrated ecclesiastical property. No legal avenue remained open to them. What little documentation of the dig exists comes from the civil engineer Hans Neuhofer, who kept a detailed journal of the operation. Though the journal was never formally published, its contents were cited in a 1984 regional academic paper on religious site concealment. Neuhofer wrote, "We found a layered structure, not just cellars, but sealed spaces within sealed spaces. It was not built to house prayer. It was built to bury memory." The silence surrounding the monastery began to crack only in 1991, when a sealed confession was discovered among the estate documents of a deceased priest, Father Theodor Klug. Formerly assigned to diocesan communications in the late 1960s, Klug had served briefly at the Schlosskloster in the months preceding its closure. His handwritten confession, dated June 1967, was addressed to whomever finds this and stored in a personal box labeled "Absolutions Denied." Klug's account is the most detailed internal testimony ever uncovered. It describes the Schlosskloster not as a monastic retreat, but as a cloister of punitive silence. New arrivals, he wrote, were not greeted with rites or sacraments, but with immediate isolation. Food was delivered through wall slots. Prayers were broadcast via speaker, never spoken communally. The confessional was a one-way device. Penance was administered, not offered. He described the narrow house annex as a subterranean chamber used for long-term containment. Those sent there were referred to only by number, and their files were kept separately in a locked room called the Archivraum. Klug claimed he had once been ordered to transport a file from this room to the rector's quarters. Inside the folder was a page marked "Retained indefinitely, theological incompatibility plus moral stubbornness." No crime was listed. His final pages recount the last days before closure. He described an atmosphere of growing paranoia among the staff. One monk had stopped speaking entirely, another wept during Mass. The rector, Father Listener, was reportedly suffering from an undiagnosed neurological condition, prone to tremors and delusional mutterings. Klug claimed the rector once confided, "We buried more spirit than we raised." The final night, Klug recalled hearing a single bell toll at 3:17 a.m., followed by footsteps and the dragging of heavy chains. By sunrise, the monastery was empty. His confession ends abruptly. "We were not shepherds. We were sentries, and what we guarded should never have been willed into being." The document's authenticity was verified in 1993 by forensic analysts hired by a regional commission investigating clerical disappearance. The Diocese of Regensburg declined to comment. No internal investigation was launched. In response to mounting inquiries, a former diocesan archivist, Carla Metzner, anonymously leaked a list of previously sealed entries from the monastery's internal transportation ledger. Among them were recurring entries labeled "Midnight Transfer," authorized by Prelate A.V. No further identification for A.V. could be located, but historical records list an auxiliary vicar named Alban Vogler, active during the years in question. Vogler's own personnel file was destroyed in 1970. One particularly haunting entry from May 1961 reads simply, "Midnight Transfer, 7 penitents, weather clear, silent handoff complete." The implication of organized nocturnal movement of confined individuals, unacknowledged by state or church, added further weight to speculation that the monastery operated as an unofficial holding site for dissident or problematic individuals within the clergy and religious laity. None of the midnight transfer entries contain follow-up destinations. None correspond to any known relocation facility. Efforts to link the Schlosskloster's practices to broader patterns across German-speaking religious orders have yielded only partial results. While isolated cases of punitive monastic isolation have been documented in Switzerland and Austria, no site has matched the scale or duration of activity implied by the Schlosskloster records. It remains, to this day, an anomaly of ecclesiastical silence. By 2005, pressure from victims' families and independent archivists pushed the Bavarian legislature to request limited diocesan cooperation in historical inquiries. The request was rejected, with the archbishopric citing the inviolability of sacred jurisdictional memory. In response, a coalition of families created the Remembrance Registry, a crowdsourced database compiling names of individuals believed to have entered Schlosskloster Heiligenberg and never re-emerged. As of July 2025, the registry contains 241 confirmed entries, each with supporting documentation of transfer, but no documented exit or death. In the preface to the registry, the editors write, "These are not forgotten souls. They are disappeared persons, erased not by war but by institution, not by fate but by policy, and they cry out in silence." In the spring of 1996, an off-trail hiker named Christoph Wenninger made a discovery in the wooded basin south of Niederwinkel, less than 2 kilometers from the buried Schlosskloster site. Beneath the overhang of an eroded limestone shelf, he found a scatter of bones protruding from disturbed earth. Nearby, scorched timbers and rusted metal fragments suggested a burned structure, though no records of any historical building existed for that parcel of land. Wenninger, believing he had stumbled upon a wartime burial or perhaps a forgotten execution site, contacted local authorities. The forensic team dispatched from Passau arrived within 48 hours. What they uncovered was not a wartime grave. Beneath the soil lay charred human remains, at least 7 individuals, all incomplete, all intermixed with ash, melted glass, and what appeared to be crushed liturgical vessels. Most disturbing was the presence of iron rings bolted into stone fragments, consistent with the restraint architecture used in correctional religious facilities during the mid-20th century. Nearby, embedded in a collapsed masonry slab, were traces of incense resin and scorched manuscript parchment. The official report filed by the Passau Forensic Unit noted evidence of high-temperature burning inconsistent with accidental fire, suggesting deliberate incineration of organic and sacred materials. Initial dating placed the destruction between 1965 and 1967, directly aligning with the final operational years of Schlosskloster Heiligenberg. A follow-up analysis of the soil revealed elevated concentrations of calcium phosphate and potassium chloride, chemical byproducts associated with accelerated bone combustion. A private consultant, Dr. Magdalena Schroff, who had previously worked on identification efforts for victims of clerical abuse in Austria, was brought in to assess the remains. Her preliminary review suggested the presence of at least 3 adolescents among the dead. She noted in her field notes, "Vertebral fusion indicates 2 subjects were likely under 20. This site was not a cemetery, it was a disposal field, ritualistic in selection, but industrial in method." The discovery briefly made local headlines. Yet within a week, diocesan representatives arrived at the site accompanied by legal counsel and announced that the land was part of a heritage trust parcel owned in perpetuity by the Holy Custody of Heiligenberg. Citing sanctified soil status, they issued an immediate injunction halting further excavation. The remains were collected and removed for ecclesiastical processing. When Dr. Schroff requested access for further study, she was informed her contract had been terminated. What followed was an orchestrated erasure. The press coverage vanished. The excavation team was dispersed. The official forensic report was redacted in archival records, with the page detailing the iron restraints replaced by a placeholder noting inconclusive artifact assessment. No public burial was held. No identification effort continued. The bones disappeared into diocesan custody. Years later, an anonymous member of the original forensic team leaked photographs of the burn site to a small academic journal in Innsbruck. The images showed a stone cross scorched at the base, a broken censer melted into slag, and what appeared to be the jawbone of a young male fused to a rusted restraint ring. The journal printed the photos alongside a brief editorial asking, "What theology requires this?" Ultaneously, a second testimony emerged, this time from a man who claimed to have helped seal the Schlosskloster's annex chambers in 1967. Josef Brenninger, a retired mason living in Salzburg, gave a taped interview to a historical review team working on forgotten ecclesiastical architecture. His name had never appeared in any construction registry, but details he provided about the monastery's interior matched blueprints recovered by researchers in Würzburg years later. Brenninger's voice was unsteady, often pausing, as if choosing his words with surgical care. "I was hired in January 67, cash only, no company name, no signature, just a man in a grey coat from the Archbishop's office. We were told we were closing off storage vaults. When we arrived, it wasn't storage, it was narrow cells, barely room to kneel. The walls were gouged, some had chains, some had carvings I didn't understand." He described being instructed to seal the vaults with quickset concrete, to layer lime in the gaps, and to leave no visible seams. "They wanted it to disappear," he said, "as if it had never been there. But one chamber, they made me go in. They locked it behind me so I could check the frame integrity. I was inside for less than a minute. It smelled like old candles and something metallic. On the wall, Someone had scratched a name. Not in German, Latin, I think, and below it, tacere. That word, Latin for to be silent, had appeared before in recovered monastery documents, often scribbled in margins, etched in stonework, or included in the monastery's marginalia prayers. It was more than an instruction. It was a command. Brenninger refused further interviews, stating only, "I built walls my whole life. But that was the first time I felt I was building a grave." Within archival circles, the testimonies of Schroff and Brenninger reignited suppressed research. A small team of German and Austrian archivists began re-examining closed ecclesiastical cases from the post-war period, searching for common patterns, transfer orders to undefined religious facilities, sudden death notices without burial sites, or abrupt termination of clerical careers with no explanation. Among the files, they located the case of Anna Marburger, a lay theological student from Freising sent to Schlosskloster Heiligenberg in 1958 after publicly criticizing church policies on celibacy. Her family received a letter 2 weeks later claiming she had withdrawn from religious life. She was never seen again. Her name later appeared in the monastery's censored census logs with a note, Archivraum File 18b. Nothing else. Those who attempted to trace the fate of individuals marked as Archivraum entries consistently met dead ends. The term, which translates simply as archive room, recurred like a refrain in surviving documents. It became a placeholder for finality. Names entered it, and no information emerged thereafter. In 2002, an internal memorandum from the Regensburg Diocesan Archive, accidentally copied into a batch of unrelated files, contained a brief reference to the closure of the Archivraum Annex following external suspicion. The document was unsigned, dated May 1967, and included a chilling instruction. Do not attempt retrieval. The chamber is now doctrinally inert. Among those who saw this document was Benedikt Walser, a former novice turned historical theologian. In a private lecture at the University of Trier, Walser posed a question that silenced the room. What is a doctrinally inert space? A chapel with no faith? Or a vault so full of unanswered prayer it's no longer safe to open? As the files grew and the patterns coalesced, a picture began to form, not of a monastery, but of a doctrinal containment site, a space engineered to erase theological error, not through discourse but through physical omission, not by persuasion but by confinement, not by confession but by disappearance. In 2010, a German doctoral student named Lena Schneider, researching unregistered religious detentions in post-war Bavaria, came across a misfiled entry in the Regensburg Regional Health Archives. The document, dated April 1962, was a transfer summary from a diocesan medical liaison, authorizing the removal of a cognitive dissonance case to a facility marked only as SH. The subject's name was Benno Hertel, age 21, a novice cleric flagged for persistent theological non-alignment and emotional obstruction. The form stood out because it had been co-signed not by a medical authority, but by a senior clerical auditor, a practice no longer permitted even under ecclesiastical law by the 1960s. The initials SH matched only one known location with that designation in Bavarian diocesan history, Schlosskloster Heiligenberg. Further, the document had been marked closed in 1967 with no notes of death, discharge, or reassignment. Driven by the possibility of a living witness, Schneider began tracing any subsequent records linked to Benno Hertel. Parish registries showed no mention post-1962. Civil records indicated no marriage, no death, and no employment. It was as if he had ceased to exist. Yet a secondary registry, one typically used for ecclesiastical pseudonyms granted in rare cases of clergy relocation under protective anonymity, listed a Benedikt Hörling arriving. In Innsbruck in 1968, registered to a Franciscan-assisted hospice. The birth date matched. The man had lived under that name until his death in 2009. In the hospice files, he had no known relatives and had left a locked case to be opened only upon credible institutional inquiry. With the cooperation of the hospice board, Schneider obtained the case. Inside were 3 items: a sealed envelope, a wooden rosary with one bead missing, and a folded document marked Archivraum File 42G. The envelope contained a handwritten letter. Though dated decades earlier, the ink was vivid, the language careful. It read, "My name was Benno Hurtle." They removed it. They said I was clouded, that my thoughts endangered others. I asked why we couldn't speak plainly of the body, the earth, the hunger in us all. They called it disobedience. They took me to a stone place, no sun. Numbers on doors, hands behind backs, meals in silence, prayers like commands. The bell rang for absence. When your name entered the Archivraum, you were no longer part of the world. The letter detailed his transfer to the eastern annex of the Schlosskloster. There he described a system of total erasure. No speech, no writing, no eye contact. Directives were delivered through a speaker grill. Obedience was measured in stillness. Disobedience triggered removal. He noted that the annex held dozens at a time, all without records in public files. He remembered their faces, but not their voices. He continued, "One night they took 5 from us, said nothing. Next morning the bell rang once, then twice, then silence for 3 days. When it rang again, only 9 of us remained. We were not brothers. We were cautionary tales." The final pages of the letter described how in the waning weeks before the monastery's closure, a structural failure, possibly a cracked drainage wall, allowed water into the lower annex. The staff panicked. No emergency was declared, but the rhythm changed. Food stopped arriving. Voices vanished. Those who had remained still were no longer watched. Benno Hurtle escaped not by design, but through neglect. In his words, they forgot to seal one of the eastern ducts. The world returned through mold, through wind, through silence broken. I followed it. I walked until a road found me. He never returned to clerical life, never contacted family. He accepted the hospice's anonymity and left only this testimony in case someone someday looked beyond the gates. The Archivraum File 42G was a folded set of censored reports detailing Hurtle's transfer, physical condition, and doctrinal evaluations. Phrases were redacted, but one note remained clear. Subject resists ontological simplification. Responds with embodied dialectic, marked for indefinite retention. The bureaucratic language, clinical and final, left no space for appeal. Schneider's discovery marked the first verifiable match between an Archivraum file and a living, or once living, subject. The confirmation that such individuals had survived, however briefly, outside the monastery's orbit, was groundbreaking. But more than that, it cracked the illusion that the system had been flawless. Hurtle's letter circulated within a small circle of investigators, but few dared publish it openly. One theologian who reviewed it, Dr. Klaus Blank, remarked, "This was not theology. It was containment theory masquerading as salvation. We don't know how many the Church buried while their hearts still beat." His words echoed as, in 2015, a digital analysis of diocesan routing led to a new revelation. Internal records showed a persistent flow of classified correspondence between the Schlosskloster and a secondary site. A hidden diocesan archive beneath the Jesuit residence of St. Lorenz in Passau. Most of the correspondence was coded or written in clerical shorthand, but a single untranslated entry read, "Archivraum consolidation complete. Doctrinal weights relocated under sealed catalogue. Living files expunged." The meaning of doctrinal weights remained ambiguous, but within the theology of the monastery's structure, it was a term that recurred, a metaphor perhaps for the burden of heresy or the pressure placed upon dissent. In the physical world, it may have referred to the very act of burial. Silence sealed in layers of stone. By 2020, a small team led by Schneider assembled what they believed was a partial index of the Archivraum system. Using overlapping entries, coded transport logs, and the remaining testimonies, they reconstructed the pattern of operational concealment. Individuals were categorized not by offense, but by potential destabilization. Those who questioned, who wrote, who refused submission were not excommunicated, they were archived. And the Schlosskloster Heiligenberg was the key vault, not a house of prayer, not a sanctuary, but a living catalogue of unapproved thought, gradually destroyed under a theology of absence. In January 2021, a small group of archivists, survivors' relatives, and independent researchers launched the Heiligenberg Digital Remembrance Map, a crowdsourced initiative designed to document disappearances associated with Schlosskloster Heiligenberg. Built as a public access platform with interactive timelines and geographic overlays, the map allowed users to input names, last known movements, and any fragment of correspondence or testimony that might indicate a connection to the monastery's network. Within its first 6 months, the map received over 300 submissions, not only from Germany, but from Austria, Switzerland, Poland, and even the United States. The patterns that emerged were unmistakable. Certain dioceses, particularly those known for aggressive enforcement of doctrinal discipline between 1935 and 1965, appeared as concentrated sources of transfers. The names submitted often carried identical terminologies in final documents: spiritual redirection, moral recalibration, or the chillingly vague phrase designated for silent correction. Researchers began layering the data against known internal church transport routes, triangulating which roads and rail lines intersected with documented Schlosskloster supply shipments. Over time, the monastery's isolation became an illusion. It was not a remote aberration. It was the center of a network. Each confirmed case added a new point to the map. Each point brought new names. One cluster, submitted by the descendants of a Czech seminarian named Václav Ruda, included a rare artifact, a fragment of a letter smuggled out of the monastery and hidden in a hymnal that had belonged to a visiting bishop. The letter, barely legible and water-damaged, contained a single plea: "Do not let us become memory. Memory dies here." The platform soon drew unwanted attention. In May 2021, a cease and desist order was issued to the site's hosting provider from the Apostolic Nuncio in Berlin. The document, signed and sealed, claimed the site threatened the pastoral privacy of the deceased and contained unverified spiritual allegations harmful to ecclesiastical continuity. While the order lacked direct legal power in Germany, its issuance sent a chilling signal. Within days, 2 of the project's organizers were contacted by their local parishes and informed their participation could jeopardize their sacraments. But the map remained online, and the submissions continued. Among them was a message from a retired paleographer, Frieda Schmidt, who had worked briefly in the 1980s with the diocesan manuscript restoration team in Würzburg. She described a peculiar set of manuscripts attributed to the Schlosskloster's scriptorium, notable not for their theology, but for their margins. Unlike typical monastic texts filled with sacred annotations or illuminations, these manuscripts bore irregular hash marks, alternating slashes, and what she described as non-grammatical repetitions of singular letters at the base of each page. Initially dismissed as copyist errors or nervous tics, these marks were archived without further inquiry, but Schmidt, troubled by their frequency and consistency, began cataloguing the marks. She discovered that when isolated and arranged in sequence, the marks corresponded to a cipher pattern used in early monastic resistance codes, subtle languages developed to communicate beneath layers of ecclesiastical oversight. With renewed access granted through the Digital Remembrance Map community, several of these manuscripts were re-examined. What unfolded was a hidden commentary embedded in the sacred texts themselves. Phrases emerged: "They do not speak, but they see." Names removed, not forgiven. And repeatedly the word saxum, Latin for stone. The phrase saxum non vertitur appeared more than once. The stone will not be turned. Archivists interpreted this as a metaphor for the buried truth of the monastery, a warning passed in whispers beneath the ink. Others saw it as a vow that what had been sealed would remain so unless deliberately uncovered. This coded marginalia reignited efforts to breach the final remaining layer of the Schlosskloster's hidden structure. The foundational annex, presumed to be collapsed or entirely sealed under post-closure concrete. By cross-referencing supply logs from 1966 and architectural maps smuggled from diocesan storage, researchers pinpointed what they believed was the true location of the Archivraum vault, a chamber beneath the eastern transept, lined with stone thick enough to muffle sound and resistant to subsurface scanning. With private donations and the backing of an international archival rights group, a team petitioned the Bavarian Heritage Council in 2022 for a limited archaeological license to conduct non-invasive probing at the identified site. The request, submitted with full legal documentation, was quietly passed to the Ministry of Religious Cultural Affairs. 6 months later, it was denied. The reason given was unprecedented. The request poses a significant risk to theological stability and may trigger irreparable sanctity violations. No legal precedent existed for such phrasing. The rejection sparked outrage within academic and human rights communities. Editorials appeared in major German publications, questioning how a theological institution could block historical excavation on land no longer actively used for worship. Protests followed, small at first, held near Niederwinkel, then more widespread, but the physical site remained untouched. In parallel, internal church sources began leaking coded communications dating back to the monastery's final months. Among them, a document labeled Rotundum 42a, an apparent instruction manual issued to Schlosskloster administrators on how to process unassimilable theological agents. The document, written in a blend of Latin and bureaucratic ecclesiastical German, described procedures for terminating doctrinal disruptions through doctrinal silence. At the bottom, one phrase stood alone: reductio in saxum, return to stone. For those studying the monastery, the implication was grim. The phrase echoed older theological metaphors of burial, but here it appeared operational. Doctrinal silence was not merely metaphorical. It was physical. Persons deemed beyond reconciliation were sealed, rendered into silence not by prayer, but by stone and concrete and bureaucratic annihilation. The weight of this realization hung over the community, maintaining the remembrance map. Names continued to arrive. Documents trickled in. Whispers became fragments. Fragments became threads. But no excavation was ever permitted. And beneath the surface of Niederwinkel's forested slope, the foundation held. In February 2023, a classified ledger surfaced from the vaults of the diocesan archive in Würzburg. It was obtained not through official request or judicial order, but through the deliberate defection of a senior archivist, a woman known publicly only by the pseudonym Miriam E. For over 3 decades, she had managed the movement of high-priority ecclesiastical records, including those transferred from Regensburg after the closure of Schlosskloster Heiligenberg. She had been trained not only in archival preservation, but in doctrinal filtration, the systematic redaction of materials deemed destabilizing to communal faith structures. Miriam's decision to defect came after she discovered the existence of what had been labeled the Sonder Register. Unlike other files which were categorized by theological themes or monastic origin, the Sonder Register was sealed within a lead-lined cabinet, marked with the insignia of the Apostolic Signatura. Its key was held not by the archivists, but by a visiting envoy from the Roman Curia, who appeared twice yearly under pretext of inventory assessment. The register itself was slim, no more than 30 bound pages, but each bore 3 columns: the name of an individual, their clerical or laic designation, and a final column with a single word: retentus, retained, not excommunicated, not deceased, simply retained. The dates aligned with transfers known to have passed through Schlosskloster Heiligenberg. At the bottom of the final page was a separate note in italic Latin: Prescriptio perpetua, non revelari, permanent prescription, not to be revealed. Miriam made a copy. She placed the document into a hollowed-out hymnal and transported it across state lines to Austria, where it was delivered to a private archive in Linz already aligned with the Remembrance Map Initiative. The publication of the ledger, redacted only to protect relatives of the vanished, sent shockwaves through investigative circles. The ledger confirmed what survivors, researchers, and families had long suspected, that Schlosskloster Heiligenberg was not only an operational center for the disappearance of dissenting voices, but that those disappearances were recorded, sanctioned, and indefinitely preserved within the highest levels of ecclesiastical authority. Of the 241 names listed in the Sonder register, 173 corresponded directly with known submissions to the remembrance map. The remaining 68 had never before been identified. Each bore a notational mark, an arc symbol that appeared in no other diocesan classification system. Theories emerged. Some believed the arc signified individuals who had resisted indoctrination even under duress. Others believed it designated subjects who had been subjected to the Archivraum protocol and subsequently silenced through irreversible confinement. Legal scholars across Germany and Austria attempted to petition for the recognition of the site as a zone of institutional disappearance, a designation typically reserved for state-run facilities used during periods of dictatorship or martial law. This effort was quickly challenged by church authorities, who argued that ecclesiastical spaces fell under canon law protections and that no secular jurisdiction could compel exposure of sanctified operations. The Vatican nuncio in Berlin released a statement in April 2023. These documents, while regrettable in their administrative tone, do not reflect criminal procedure. They reflect the burden of spiritual guardianship. The term spiritual guardianship was received with outrage by victim advocacy groups, who accused the Church of linguistic concealment designed to neutralize acts of psychological and physical erasure. A protest staged outside the former Schlosskloster site drew over 300 participants: families, archivists, human rights lawyers, and clergy in silent dissent. At the center of the protest, a steel plaque was placed into the soil, bearing the names of 50 individuals confirmed through the Sonder register. No state authority attempted to remove it, but by morning, it was gone. In its place was a laminated note taped to a wooden cross. The note read, "The stone remains, do not disturb." That phrase, "the stone remains," became a symbol for the final phase of institutional resistance. Even as files surfaced, even as testimonies were validated, and even as public demand for recognition escalated, the physical site of Schlosskloster Heiligenberg remained untouched. Its foundations were still intact, its subterranean vaults still sealed. No judicial mandate had succeeded in breaking the ecclesiastical barrier, and yet the silence cracked again, this time from within the theological community. A group of scholars from Tübingen and Salzburg released a joint paper titled "Canonized Silence and the Architecture of Erasure." It challenged the Church's defense of the monastery as a matter of spiritual jurisdiction. Instead, it framed Schlosskloster Heiligenberg as a case of architectural theology, the deliberate use of physical structures to enforce doctrinal submission. The paper argued that the annex system, the Archivraum, and the ritual of disappearance formed a triune model of clerical control, mirroring ecclesiastical hierarchies but applied inwardly against its own members. This paper was followed by a theological petition signed by over 90 Catholic scholars worldwide. The petition demanded open investigation, exhumation of the monastery site, and ecclesiastical confession. While no response was given by the Roman Curia, multiple signatories received letters from their local bishops expressing concern over alignment with speculative history. The final act of revelation came not from a ledger or a protest, but from a relic. In November 2024, during the renovation of a regional museum in Regensburg, a glass reliquary was discovered sealed behind a false wall. Inside was a scrap of wool, a tarnished crucifix, and a parchment slip bearing a name, Rudolf Pischler. Alongside it, a phrase, "Non rediat, nos me minimus." He did not return. We remember. The museum contacted the Remembrance Map team. The name matched a disappearance long suspected but never confirmed. Rudolf had been one of the earliest transfers to Schlosskloster Heiligenberg, sent in 1951. His parents had died never knowing what happened to him. The relic was placed on display in a glass case beside the full ledger, the manuscript marginalia, and a printed version of Benno Hürtel's final letter. Visitors filed in silently. Many brought candles, some brought names, and for the first time in public record, the phrase used so often in whisper and in code was spoken aloud on camera. Reductio in saxum, return to stone. But this time it was not a command. It was an accusation. If this story impacted you, If you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.